Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the American Logistics Aid Network, Big City Emergency Managers, the Governor's Homeland Security Advisors Council, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the International City County Management Association, the National Emergency Management Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will kick off our America in Transition webinar series, discussing what leaders need to know as we head into 2023. Today, our panel will discuss vulnerable aspects of the domestic supply chain, as well as our energy networks, examining single points of failure for U.S. commerce. One administrative note before we get into today's program: during our live broadcast, we invited our audience to use the QR code to reply to a couple of questions that the panel posed on supply chain and energy questions. You'll see those as we go through the broadcast today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. David Kaufman is a frequent lecturer and instructor here at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. He is the president and director for safety and security at CNA, a nonprofit organization providing in-depth research, analysis, and solutions for government leaders, where his team helps develop strategies to advance supply chain resilience. At CNA, Dave is responsible for executive management, development, and CNA's work in the areas of public safety, homeland security, emergency management, and public health. From 2009 to 2015, Dave served as the Associate Administrator for Policy, Program Analysis, and International Affairs at FEMA. And during his time there, Dave developed the agency's whole community approach to emergency management, along with its supporting document, and also launched FEMA's Strategic Foresight Initiative. Dave, thank you for leading today's discussion, and now I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Dawn, and welcome everyone. I'm excited for this afternoon's discussion. Let me begin by introducing our esteemed panel. Mary Long is the CEO of Agility. She's a board advisor to the American Logistics Aid Network and a lecturer at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She has previously held executive supply chain leadership roles at Domino's, Campbell's Soup, and worked with a number of other leading food industry companies. Mary is also a previous chair of the board of directors for the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals and is on the editorial board for Supply Chain Quarterly, the review board for the Journal of Supply Chain Management, Logistics, and Procurement. Tim Manning is the president of Berglund Manning LC, an international resilience, security, and strategic policy consulting firm. Most recently, Tim served as the White House COVID-19 supply coordinator, where he oversaw the U.S. government's efforts to resolve supply chain challenges and logistics for essential tools needed to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. He is a former deputy administrator of FEMA and currently serves as a senior advisor for the Pacific Disaster Center. He's also on the faculty of the Center for Global Health and Security and the Emergency and Disaster Management Studies program at Georgetown University. Dr. Scott Tinker is director of the Texas Bureau of Economic Geology and serves as the state geologist of Texas. Scott is the all-day chair of the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas, Austin. He is also chairman of the nonprofit Switch Energy Alliance and is the host of PBS Energy Switch, an energy and climate talk show appearing on over 40 PBS stations nationwide. Scott also appears weekly on Earth Date on over 450 radio stations around the United States. Scott's writings have appeared in publications ranging from Forbes to Fortune to Scientific American. So, as you can see, we have a great panel here to join us this afternoon. Let me pose a first question to get us started, and then I will move from here. So this is a question to all of you. If you had a moment to click on the QR code while we were at the opening, your results are already tabulated in here. But very interesting responses. So just looking at sort of how Participants in today's webinar answered the question, how has your organization's attention to supply chain issues changed over the past 3 years? So heavy focus on seeking to understand and mitigate supply chain dependencies affecting your own organizations, as well as better understanding supply chain flows and their relationship to risk of disruption. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Tim, I'd like to turn to you to kick us off and get us started. You sat in a very interesting position, kind of at the nexus of government and industry in the midst of a global crisis. As you reflect on your experiences, what has the COVID-19 pandemic taught us about supply chains in the context of crisis management?
Well, thanks, Dave. And good to see everybody here. And thank you for CHDS for putting this together. It's a great question. I think something I think many of us have experienced doing disaster logistics for a long time is that too often the government and industry kind of look at each other kind of in a transactional way, that it's just a procurement relationship, and otherwise you try to keep walls up between. And I think what we found in this crisis, and what we've seen in previous large crises as well, is that when things reach the scale where they impact entire populations, both on the manufacturing side and in the response side, you need those closer relationships. You need to understand, both sides need to understand what the other is dealing with in a kind of a more operational way. And we didn't have those relationships going into the COVID response. We had to build them on the fly. Many government officials, certainly in the emergency response, homeland security space, don't really necessarily always understand the market dynamics that impact the way a company behaves or doesn't behave, and the second, third, fourth orders of suppliers away from key commodities, and how to pull those kind of critical levers that the government has to solve some of those problems. So we were really having to build a lot of mechanism, a lot of relationships, a lot of structures on the fly, educate industry on how the government works and government how industry works. We've learned a lot of lessons. We've captured a lot of lessons. We've experienced a lot of things. Hopefully we learn from them and build better systems in the future.
So I'm curious, as I'm listening to you talk and I'm thinking about other conversations you and I have had on this topic, it strikes me that the COVID-19 pandemic is the first time that in sort of a domestic disaster management context, we've actually suffered supply shortage in a strategic sense, right? And there was a lot of talk in the first 6 months of the pandemic about Defense Production Act authorities and how the government can intervene in the industrial economy to stimulate production of critical things. There was Project Airbridge, et cetera, to try to expedite the bringing of supply for PPE and other similar equipment. There were partnerships struck with auto manufacturers to make respirators, not respirators, but ventilators. Thank you very much. I'm curious, what do you believe demonstrated some of the most effective ways for government to engage industry in the moment to stimulate good public good outcomes?
Yeah, I think some of those examples are great, and some worked really well. Some of those interventions worked really well, others less so. I think there's a tendency, a need on the part of governments in a crisis to, really just try everything, right? We've got to resolve these shortages right away. Now, this isn't the first time it's the first time we've dealt with it on a global scale, really probably ever in 100 years of a crisis like this, but we didn't have the kind of global manufacturing interconnectivity that in the early 1900s that we have today. So it's really the first time, and we're still seeing those disruptions. And we, in all the exercising and all the planning we've done, we anticipated that there would be this kind of, I'm going to hold on to goods, I'm not going to probably offer a whole lot in mutual aid or in help in a globally constrained environment. And it's kind of what we saw happen. But some of the early actions, maybe we were maybe a little less thought through of what are the third order effects of us doing this. So as an example, we in a huge push to manufacture vaccine, we used pretty heavy use of the Defense Production Act to prioritize the commodities going to COVID vaccine. And as a result, I spent a number of people spent a great deal of time trying to make sure we could still make flu vaccine, trying to make sure we could still make other essential medicines, trying to help make sure that other plants around the world can continue to make vaccine. It's easy to use these extraordinary tools as blunt instruments. It's much more challenging to use them as refined, kind of like as a scalpel. And what we learned over the course of the couple of years that we were doing all of this was how to be more subtle and how to achieve the policy outcomes we were trying to achieve through more creative mechanisms and maybe a little less blunt force as we saw in the early days. But I think the big takeaway is that we've got to acknowledge that we have to understand now what we did and going forward. When the Ebola crisis happened, in the government agencies, some of you might recall, we were all rushing to buy PPE. The first one to market happened to be Department of Defense with a DPA priority rating on it, and then other agencies couldn't get at the PPE material they needed. So we need a more kind of broad understanding of what happens when you do these things, what impacts are you going to have, and what are the potential unintended negative consequences of these actions, of which we learned quite a few.
Mary, I'd like to bring you into this. We're largely looking backwards right now, but the world's changing as we speak. How do you see the supply chain field evolving? What are the key trends that we should be paying attention to about how things are shifting now going forward?
Thanks, Dave. And I'll tag on to some of the things Tim said. I call myself a supply chain evangelist because this is what I've done my whole career, all those different food companies. This has been my gig. And what I love about supply chain is that we sit at the center of systems thinking, like a top-down approach for how do we interconnect these broad ecosystems in more efficient ways. But we also do that, all activity happens through people. So it's design thinking as well. So how do the humans, how do we as human beings operate in these complex systems? And that's exactly, Tim, what you're talking about. It's easy to, or it can be a tendency for us in supply chain. I only speak as a practitioner, to try to implement blunt force ourselves in changing things. And that was how we had designed supply chains pre-COVID. We made them long, global, brittle supply chains with a tendency to break. But they were options, they were optimized for efficiency and low cost. And the supply shock showed us that is something unprecedented that we hadn't experienced before, that where we shut down global economies. Before, we operated in a world where we thought it was 90% certain, and it shifted to 90% uncertain. And that's the world we live in now. It no longer can optimize an uncertain and changing environment. All we do now is optionize. We create options and then try to explain them going forward, like what would be the pros and cons of different actions. So that's kind of the trends that I see then related to that are definitely figuring out planning is a huge area of focus, where we move that fulcrum closer to the demand signal and we increase the frequency of demand plans. Are some, very tactical supply chain things that are happening now. And then the global supply chains are shifting to, can we reshore? Can we nearshore? Can we friendshore? Can we be in ecosystems that are closer to us, that we know more about them, and call that friendshoring? So those are a couple. I could go on, I teach this stuff. So
I might need to take your class. How did digital signals play into all of this, and how is the digital revolution affecting supply chain resilience?
You want me to tag on to that?
Yes, please. Sorry,
okay.
that was a follow-up to you.
Okay, yep. I mean, digitalization, that's the area that really within Domino's supply chain and Campbell's Soup, that's what I spent a ton of time trying to build visibility, because you bring up a really great point. You know, the way we can also gain more clarity for everyone that's connected to these ecosystems is bringing more visibility to it. And I know from my colleagues here at UT on the economics side of the business college that what they find frustrating about supply chain is the lack of global signals for this massive industry that's interconnected. And so that is an area that those planning signals, even if we just stick to planning, we are using more predictive modeling that is more built on AI. It does create more cybersecurity risks, but when you think about it, a planner that does not have a set opinion about the signals they're seeing, the research shows that they do a better job at the demand plan that they're creating, or in the supply plan they're creating. And then a role for human beings is really more using those digital signals for intervention, for future planning scenarios, and to build stronger algorithms. So to me, the huge area for digitalization, we're going to see more use of drones, more use of automation, more use of robotics and predictive modeling.
So it seems to me there are two key themes just already emerging just from your comments and from Tim's. One around recognizing criticality, and one around sort of continuing to encourage the shift that you alluded to from kind of a focus on efficiency and low cost to one that is more about how did you say it? Not optimizing, but optionalizing. And so, you know, I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of Homeland Security leaders. So first, sort of to both of you, how and where is the lens of strategic criticality exist in commodity flows? And is that a value that Homeland Security leaders can bring to the problem space, if you will?
One thing I'll say in my experience, that even when people that are deeply in the supply chain part of industry get this intuitively, but it's not common that you see it more broadly in the leadership and the C-suites of even kind of major manufacturers, the understanding of the interdependencies that, you know, kind of almost intuitive in the Homeland Security practitioner, the understanding, you know, the nexus of the various critical infrastructures, sectors, with the human factors, with government, with policymakers, with non-government, with, you know, communities, and you don't always really see that. And so I think that's one potential in, you know, in advancing more of the public-private partnership approach to building resilience, is exploiting that, right? Marrying the two kind of expertise. I think really every advancement we've ever had comes from interdisciplinary work. And this is I think a really good example of where that could be useful. I'll give you one, you know, concrete example is we probably will talk about energy here in a little bit. You know, the biggest supply chain disruption of the entire COVID response really had nothing to do with COVID. I mean, in fact, a lot of the disruptions from during the COVID response were exacerbated by COVID, but not really COVID at its root. But the biggest one was the power outages in Texas in February of 2021, which caused shutdowns in the petrochemical industry, which caused the resin manufacturers, the resins that go into all of the devices, all the goods, and everything, plastic, all the thermoplastic. Those impacts are still being felt today in this late November, December of 22. Almost 2 years later, and that had nothing to do with COVID. That was a That was a climate thing combined with the kind of fragility of the Texas power grid and the regulatory issues where Texas is kind of an isolated grid, and all of those things that we and the people in the Homeland Security community understand, but isn't understood on the industry side, right? And so even as companies are talking about diversifying now their suppliers, they're not understanding, nobody's taking the time to look 3 or 4 layers back, what caused the disruption in resins. They're just thinking, oh, my supplier couldn't give me what I need, I'm going to lay in a couple of other suppliers, but they're going to stay on the same power grid. It does nothing for them, right? That kind of thinking that is common in the Homeland Security space is not super common in industry. And so I think not unheard of, but just not as common. So there's definitely space for everybody to work.
That's a great point. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add? Otherwise, I think Tim just gave us a great transition to talk about energy.
I think that's a great segue. Let's go.
Let's do that then. So let's pull our audience back in for a minute and come to the second survey question that we had posed. So we'll bring this up. If you didn't get a chance to log on to menti.com, the code is at the top of the screen, 59851080. And this is probing how your organizations think about energy issues today. So here there's a little bit of a different distribution, less concentration on focus on how these issues affect our organization directly, and more emphasis on a combination of climate impacts and national security implications associated with U.S. energy dependence. So that's also very interesting to see sort of what the disposition is of the organizations represented by our participants on the webinar. We'll leave that up for just a second and then transition over. And Scott, I'd like to pull you into this conversation. Energy issues have been present, shall we say, in the news on a pretty consistent basis over the past year. Much of what I see is triggered or linked back to the war in the Ukraine, or is, very grassroots level price at the pump type stories. But I suspect those may not be telling the whole picture here. So could you help fill in the gaps in this space? How should we be thinking about energy issues today in the US, in the world?
Yeah. Well, Dave, it's good to be here with you and everyone else. It's not a simple topic, obviously. I think Ukraine and gasoline prices are right there in our daily lives and news and feeds, but they're really symptoms of larger policy trends. I mean, in Ukraine, Mr. Putin took advantage of Germany's dependence on natural gas from Russia and its energy Wende policy, which really began back around 2010. And in that policy, Germany intentionally reduced coal significantly, but then it stopped pursuit of its own natural gas, which it has. And post-Fukushima actually began shutting down nuclear, which it continued to do for quite a while. And now there's some debate over a few reactors that are left. And so this is policy. Ukraine exacerbated that, and that reflects itself across Europe and, in fact, the world. So we really have to think about those policies. Gas prices are also often partly related to policy, partly to economics, basic supply and demand, and investability and investments that are being made. I mean, it reflects that global supply and demand. There have been U.S. signals from this administration to reduce and shut down oil and gas in the U.S., strong signals to the investment community. There's been a lack of development and infrastructure as a result of those signals. It's investment in oil and gas is half of what it was just 4 or 5 years ago. It's incredible how quickly that has shut down, particularly in the West, not globally. So those are symptoms of policy decisions, and they may be good, they may be bad. I don't know. I'm not going to judge the decisions, but we have to recognize that it isn't something that the evil oil industry is jacking up oil prices. They don't really control those. And the situation in Europe, this severe energy crisis, isn't the result of the invasion in Ukraine. It's just exacerbated by that. So you said, what are some other things? Well, I mean, I think one of the very important things is every global leader on the planet focuses on energy security. That is front of mind. They may not say it publicly. They may talk about other things, climate and other things, but it is the thing that is key to every global leader. Some have secure energy, most don't. Another important thing is that binary solutions don't exist. This clean and dirty, good and bad. It sounds good, it's simple, but unfortunately, it's not real. All forms of energy have impact, both positive and negative, on economies and the environment. I mean, we know the impact of coal and oil and natural gas and nuclear. Those have been prominently brought to us, and they're real, educated right through the schools. Those are handled better in wealthy nations than in poor nations, by the way. But another one that isn't quite so well known is there's no renewable energy. And I'll say that again, there's no renewable energy. There's no source of energy that's renewable. The sun and the wind are, but the collectors of that heat and that light and that motion require earth resources. Significant amounts of earth resources, because those sources of heat, light, and motion are not dense. Not like nuclear or natural gas, very dense forms of energy. So you have to do a whole lot of mining and manufacturing and disposal, because panels and turbines and batteries wear out 10 to 25 years, depending on where you are and what they look like. You got to make them again and again. So you mine, manufacture, dispose, and do it again and again. It's not renewable. So this is important, I think, for global leaders and all the public to begin to understand that all forms of energy have positives and they have negatives as we go through that. And I think the other important thing, a very hard lesson being learned right now in Europe and parts of the US, is that weather-dependent sources like wind and solar, unfortunately, they're not more affordable and they're not more reliable. Some leaders believed they were, and they were told they were, but they're not. They're and I don't want you, that's not a negative. I've installed solar around the world. They have a role to play, to be sure, but just a role. Reliability is very expensive. It takes a lot to make an intermittent source reliable to the consumer. A lot of expensive stuff, backup stuff, a load following power plant, a big battery, etc., to make that always on. And we can talk about Winter Storm Uri. There's plenty of opinions about it in Texas. If opinions were renewable, we'd be done. But it's just not. And so you see that cost very high. Europe is paying 50, 60 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. You may not speak kilowatt hour, and I don't know, but the US we pay between 10 and 30 in California, somewhere in there, 10 and 12 in Texas cents, a fifth of that. And the same with natural gas prices and other things. So they're very interrelated things, and policy does matter tremendously. So we've got to begin to recognize how policy and economics and then earth resources all play together in these bigger trends.
So I'd like to pull the thread on that a little bit, because I think that's really interesting. And the linkage back to policy strikes me as exceedingly important. So the Inflation Reduction Act, right, just passed, includes significant funding for renewable energy technologies. Listening to you talk about the limitations of every form of energy, how do you see these investments that will be made, are being made, and will take shape and form in the months and years ahead, changing the energy landscape and the risk landscape associated with energy?
Yeah. Again, I think we as leaders need to recognize this real dual challenge that exists. And that's the reality that all sources of energy in the world continue to increase. Nothing has gone down yet, including hay and biomass, because population grows and demand for energy with industrialization grows. Emerging and developing economies per capita are using more, and there are more people there. So every form of energy is increasing. We're at an all-time high for coal use in the world today. Now, geopolitically, we see some changes and reductions. The wealthier nations that started on coal are going down in coal, replacing it with other things. But so we recognize this dual challenge that we have to have energy addition and we have to reduce emissions. that's really this transition we all talk about, is adding energy for the world to thrive, human flourishing, and reducing environmental impacts of those forms of energy. So the IRA has some good things in it to do that. It does fall into the trap a bit of picking winners, as all governments like to do, you know, and in energy that has been remarkably unsuccessful throughout every presidential administration. Picking a winner rarely results in something that the markets say, oh, sure, we'll go do that at scale. So I think the biggest thing that we think about with the IRA and other things is optionality. And we mentioned that earlier, options were mentioned earlier. It's very important in energy, is not getting rid of options by law or policy. When you start to reduce options by policy, it's a bad idea. Things start to implode. And you can see that happening again, where Germany got rid of coal, they got rid of gas, they got rid of nuclear. What's left? So we can't do that. We have to incentivize by setting targets for things, let's say emissions reductions, and then letting different forms of energy compete in those target zones, let markets compete and be rewarded for that if they're able to accomplish it, whatever that goal is, emissions reductions or, and a reliable energy, affordable energy. So it's a different strategy, I think. The IRA has some funds for that, but it does tend to tilt toward one set of choices more than others. And it is a risk in that. So, there's security implications to all of that for sure.
So you mentioned that demand for energy continues to increase, that energy production continues to increase, that we're moving to increasingly adding newer, less dense, less consistent sources of supply, and hence your point about reliability. Like, Tim mentioned the Texas power grid outage earlier in the conversation, and you referenced that as well. Does the introduction, do these trends, does this shift introduce new system vulnerabilities that we need to be thinking about, either in the context of potential attack vectors or simply less system resilience in the face of surges in energy demand, either because of the reliability issues, et cetera? I mean, I'm sort of hearing some faint alarm bells going off in the back of my mind as I'm listening to you talk, thinking about where's the power going to start going out next, and maybe not in the same places that we're used to thinking about it.
Sure. Yes, I mean, it does introduce some vulnerabilities, and it may help to mitigate some vulnerabilities. I think, again, the point is portfolios are important across the board, not just in energy. I don't own one stock. I don't, if I'm real estate, I don't own one piece of real estate. Portfolios matter. And so optionality matters. Each form of energy has different components of it that are positive, including just changing human lives. And I think we rarely talk about the positive aspects of access to affordable, reliable energy across the rich world. But I promise you, and I've traveled to 60 countries and gone into the poorest of the poor, made films about it. That's not front of mind to the poor world. And it's the big transition. It's not either or, but just having basic human needs addressed is critical in about 3/4 of the world today still. So system reliabilities, sure, you have to balance the things. Right now, Europe, UK particularly, but parts of Europe are in sort of a wind calm period again. What do we do? It doesn't matter how many turbines are up if it's calm. And so you have to have things that play together. And these are not simple. I mean, the electricity system is a bloody complicated system. Very few people understand it. And I count myself in that as not understanding it that well. And I study it tremendously. When I hear somebody say they understand it, I kind of know they don't, because it's really complicated. And so how do you really go about leveraging all of the things that we're able to do now with data and artificial intelligence and data science and other kinds of things with the grid and with this distributed energy, and bring all that together so that we can all have access to affordable, reliable electricity and other forms of energy. It's not simple. It's going to vary geopolitically. It's going to vary by what resources you have access to. It's going to vary by talent and education and what you can do in your various geopolitical regions. So it's something that I think we can't mandate or edict on, for better or worse, but we do have to recognize the different components of it and how we optimize on those. And optimization and looking at that long-term optimization is really important. The trade-offs exist in all these things, and what are they? What are we optimizing on? And I think as you start to look at that, as you start to think about what's really scalable, affordable, and reliable, you end up with not that many things globally being components of it. Nuclear is a big piece of it. Natural gas, replacing coal, acts as a source of hydrogen, capturing carbon, solar, wind, and batteries as part of it. There are not that many wedges or levers we can throw here. And I think we all understand this. We got to kind of, as best we can, pull the politics out of that. It's too important to play politics with, and really work toward those key investments and infrastructure.
You know, it also, I think it's unfortunate that system complexity, discussions about portfolios and options don't lend themselves well to political sound bites.
No, they don't.
So not only is it politicized, but the way you're calling for our political leaders to discuss and engage is almost antithetical to what gets them media time.
David, it's such an important point. And this is what we're trying to do on our PBS Energy Switch, which just got picked up by World now. So it's on 70-something% of PBS stations nationwide, is have civil dialogue. Have two guests on every show. We dive into something deeply for 25 minutes. They don't agree on everything. That's the point. But we discuss it civilly. We try to think deeply about it, and we show some of the real challenges of these things. And there's no good and bad actors here, really. There can be, but how does it really work? You know, why are we having differences, and where can we look at the margins and improve on some of those things? It doesn't lend itself well to the politics that way. And that's why I'm always a little concerned when the politics leads in terms of, it has to do with policy, but again, set some goals and then let other kinds of things, including markets, start to address those bigger goals.
So it strikes me, I have a particular question for you about China, but I'm going to put that aside for a moment because it strikes me that there's an interesting parallel in the points that you just made with the points that Tim and Mary made a little bit earlier. And it really is, it has to do with how we understand A, the outcomes we're seeking to achieve, and B, how we government engage to facilitate those outcomes. You talked about picking winners and losers. Tim, you talked a little bit about sort of, I would characterize the perhaps the partnership model versus the direct action model. You know, there's a problem, we're going to go solve it ourselves, we government, versus we're gonna step back, understand contextually what's happening and who we need to engage with to help enable them to go solve it. Which is again that same point about market forces. Is that parallel about how we leverage market dynamics and engage market dynamics to achieve public good outcomes? Does that ring true with all of you? And if so, how do we get better at this? I'm not feeling great about our level of sophistication based on this conversation.
Yeah, Dave, if I can jump on that real quick. Yeah, I think there's the challenge, I think, is that there are those who are maybe a little too dogmatic on either side of that equation. And the reality is some kind of blend in the middle. The idea that markets will resolve it on their own sometimes works. I think what we found in crisis, that does not. The markets don't respond in time for crisis, not for the public good necessarily. markets will respond to the, the financial betterment of the, whomever that might be. Time and time again, we saw, I won't name names, but I can give examples of companies, critical companies with critical goods, choosing not to come into the market in a timeline that would save lives because there was a financial risk. And the fiduciary responsibility of the company is to their shareholders. And they're not going to, they can't knowingly make a financially bad decision, even if it means the betterment of humanity. Often some have a higher level of risk in that regard than others, but the reality is that's the reality. Companies won't act in their own financial disinterest unless they're incentivized by government or forced to do by government. And sometimes that just takes the form of top cover, right? That there's a forcing mechanism or de-risking action on the part of the government that allows a company to do something. We did plenty of I did plenty of things. The government has done plenty of things where large investments using extraordinary, rarely used authorities in the federal rules of acquisition to go fast to incentivize companies to behave in a way that they would not have otherwise. The industry learned through crisis what they shouldn't do from a fiduciary perspective, and it's just a general kind of idea that if there's a shortage, if there's a supply and demand, if there's an over demand, then the market will respond to supply, and that's probably true, but not in a timeline that you need. So there needs to be a balance of intervention, sometimes directive, sometimes cooperative. Sometimes the government needs to just let the markets behave, but both sides need to understand there's nuance there and be willing to pull the trigger. Sometimes unpopular decisions on the part of government, but needed to save lives. And that in the national security space and the homeland security space and crisis, that makes a certain amount of sense. As you start getting into the kind of national security adjacent communities, like semiconductor manufacturing, for example, that gets a little more gray. But there are lessons that we've all experienced, and I think we'd be remiss if we just ignored them.
I think you could take your comments though and use them to begin sketching out an engagement framework and revealing strategies that can help with that de-risking. Mm-hmm. I think that's a useful lens. Mary, Scott, did you have thoughts to offer?
Well, that's actually where I was going as well, Dave. What Tim said about this being a good time from a supply chain practitioner viewpoint, that there's been more visibility now to the role that government can play and how it can move regulations for them. So I would say that when I used to do collaboration work at Campbell's, the way we thought about it was with our suppliers, with service providers, and with customers. We didn't really think of the government at all. They didn't, I mean, from my perspective as a practitioner, it wasn't something front and center. And the way that we segmented how we were going to use limited resources to do that kind of work was to assess whether any of our partners were, how willing and how capable were they. So now is a time where governments, local governments, regional, as they're creating engagement plans and they want to find out information from industry, they can use more visibility to these kinds of questions and more understanding of what the private sector, what is happening there, to say we are willing and we are capable to partner with you, and we have information that may be valuable to you, or together we can strengthen our community and we can work on this. Like, I really believe in public-private partnership is a strong path forward, but to some of the questions in the Q&A, it does, like Doug Conan, the CEO of Campbell's, we started with inspiring trust, and that inspiring trust is the beginning of the flywheel to create direction, to drive alignment, to execute with excellence, to produce extraordinary results. So, and I probably skipped one there, but you know, that type of thing, it doesn't happen on a dime. It's not like coordinating something with unknown players, but you know what the game plan is and you've practiced it. So you don't really need to know each other's business and their style and relationship, but collaboration takes trust. If you're going to share something that's somewhat private and could be risky to share, then you need to know that person and you need to build that over time. It doesn't happen just by a phone call or, you know, one type of event. So, so those are my two observations on some of the things that have come up in chat, and we could have a whole separate conversation on just in time and other things. So.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Mary.
I share a couple quick thoughts, David, to get to other stuff too, but I agree with Tim. I mean, either or is not the solution here. There are roles to play for federal, state, and local policy and incentives and markets as well. It's one of the great challenges, I think, in energy is balancing those. There are plenty of examples of picking winners as opposed to setting targets. We could use a big one of emissions. We want to reduce emissions. Anybody who's able to do that, there are certain levels of incentives at scale and affordably. Can coal play? Sure, I know how to capture CO2 emissions from coal power plants, and that's old technology. Can you play affordably? Well, good luck. You know, how are you going to do that? And maybe you can, where you have great coal, real hard coal, and great sources of sequestration nearby, and other, maybe you can't in other places. So rather than trying to pick and eliminate fuels, which is what I think a lot of policy talks about doing now, we're going to get rid of these fuels. No, we're not. That's just a fallacy. The world is not decreasing oil and gas and coal. It's increasing them. Europe and the US are, but we represent 7% of the global population combined today. Of the global population, we represent a lot more of that in market demand, but that won't always be the case. And so we really have to begin to conflate these things and say, what post COP27 that just ended in Egypt, Africa leaders were saying pretty strongly, we're going to use oil and gas and probably coal, although we don't have much. We're going to use these other things too as we start to develop our economy. And we gotta be practically driven about what the world is, not what it would be ideally. And they pointed rightfully at Europe and said, hey, you know, you've had your natural gas cut off recently by a pipeline getting shut down. What are you using? Oh, you're using coal. Interesting. And you're telling us not to. So this is the global reality that 3/4 of the world is just coming up from severe to moderate to mixed poverty. And that's the real world in energy. Okay.
Great points. Dawn, let me pull you back into this. What kind of questions do we have from our participants that we could spend some time on together?
Thanks, Dave. Several questions coming in for really any of our panelists to talk about the human resource supply chain and how has COVID and the Great Resignation here domestically impacted our commodity supply chains and maybe even our energy security. So I'll throw that open to any of the panelists that would like to tackle that.
We'd like to start.
Looks like Mary's gonna go.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I
Mary.
can jump in real quick on the two roles that elevated from a board visibility for in the private sector were the role of the chief supply chain officer and the chief HR officer. I mean, right away, these areas that had been talked about at a C-suite level, but had not really had a place where they routinely sat at the table and were really integrated into the plans, all of a sudden became the plan. And so I think that is continuing because those roles have continued to show the value of exactly what is being asked in these questions around, aren't these integrated plans, the people planning, the human resources, and what you're operationally trying to achieve? Yes, they're interconnected. So they have to be linked.
Tim,
I'll
did you
jump
have
on
comments?
that too. Yeah, I'll just say that you know, when you start, as I've been talking about, deconstructing what the disruptions are, right? When the government was trying to help by intervening and using these authorities, you got to start peeling back. Why are we having disruptions? And at the root of a lot of it was HR. Still is. There in more so in the U.S. Than in imports. The manufacturing in other parts of the world is everybody's having these challenges, but we're seeing especially severe in the U.S. There are a lot of places where it wasn't about the square footage of the plant. It wasn't about an extra line. It was about the human resources, about the people or the lack thereof to actually work within the facilities to bring the commodities to bear. And it's not getting any better. Yeah, that's like every conversation I have with leadership and industry is the problem. Help us solve these problems. And there are no good like outside, we talk about all these incentivizing policies on the part of governments. There are very many, if any, ways the government can help in that space.
One of the talent challenges, I think, agreeing with both of those points strongly is we seem like to be a bellows in the world, and nationalize, globalize, and kind of these trends. And in a nationalizing trend, you can't have to focus a little more on your own talent, and you start looking around and say, where are the nuclear engineers? Oh, there aren't many here. Where are the people who have expertise in a variety of things? That becomes a challenge. And so I would love to see us reinvesting in talent, which I think the way I took that question globally, but also nationally, some of the things that we may not think are going to be as prominent today probably still will be, because these systems take a long time to change, and we are going to need talent. And I'd love to see our young people not just going into finance and other things, but into engineering and science again, and maths and other kinds of harder problems. And they're going to be very well utilized as this all plays out.
Supply chain.
Yes, Mary, exactly.
Dave, we've also had several questions come in regarding the foreign role as it relates to security, both for our commodity supply chains as well as our own energy security, and several questions for the panelists. And again, I'll ask all three to take a swing at this. What do you see as the greatest security threat to our energy systems and networks, to our supply chain continuity from foreign actors, nation state or terrorism? Maybe
I could start on that one, and I have plenty of data to show you. Energy resources exist where geology put them. That may be liquids like oil or natural gas. It may be coal, solid things. It may be uranium and thorium. It may be copper and cobalt and other kinds of things that are going to be critical for wind turbines and panels and batteries. But they exist where they exist. China brilliantly, through its Belt and Roads policy, went out and invested around the world in buying those things. And they didn't buy the resource in place, that's still mine there. They bought the processing of it. And China now processes 80% of the world's material needed for solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. 80%. That's the fuel of the transportation future, interestingly. So are we going to shift from OPEC, liquids, gasoline, diesel, jet fuels, to China for batteries? Who's going to control the resources? Who's going to control the supply chains? Again, I'm not judging that, but we need, as Homeland Security people, to be aware of where the supply chains start and the fact that it's not a one-time only thing. We always have to mine and manufacture and dispose regardless, or drill in the case of oil and gas, et cetera. So these are critical pieces of the early supply chain.
I mean, I'll extend on that, and in the kind of broader supply chains. Yeah, I mean, yeah, as Scott mentioned, that China's activity, the Belt and Roads project, and even beyond the the processing, they bought, maybe this is too strong a way to put it, but they bought favor around the world as well. They're investing in infrastructure. They're literally building roads and buildings, in all over the world. Everywhere I travel, there's a new road system, a new something being built by China, infrastructure given as a gift. And, I think it's a little of a field from the supply chain side, but, we've certainly got that network vulnerability, those concerns that this is all running through, on a Chinese backbone. But from a, manufacturing perspective, from a supply chain perspective, I think what we're seeing in what Mary described as this look, kind of a shift away from these long stretched out brittle supply chains into kind of shorter, more resilient, maybe more diverse, geographically diverse, if nothing else, sourcing, and getting out of, we have an extraordinarily high concentration in supply from China. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, for one, we got extraordinarily lucky that they didn't just completely shut down exports. Now that would have probably tanked a big part of their economy, probably a big reason they didn't do it, but we got lucky there because we were way over reliant. We still are. But through the zero COVID policy for the last 18 months has caused massive disruptions in supply, both in the manufacturing of the raw materials and some components and finished product, but also in the shipment, coming across the Pacific. Now, as that's opening up in the face of the protests, now they're seeing these massive upswing in COVID cases. So all this concentrated manufacturing in China poses an extraordinary vulnerability in the availability of supply. Now, we did a lot of things. There was a point a year ago or so where we were self-sufficient. The United States was self-sufficient in the manufacturing of N95 respirators. We had made enough investments, both the government investments, de-risking investments, industrial base expansion, DPA kind of stuff, venture capitalists, industry expansion, people reshoring. We were 100% self-sufficient, and it lasted for like a month. Because China can undercut on labor costs, and costs generally, all of that shifted back overseas. As soon as there stopped being a resource constraint, people started chasing cost savings again, and that goes overseas. So we have this kind of challenge where the markets want cost efficiency, they want cost savings. That means going into geographically concentrated, geopolitically risky environments that create these brittle supply chains that when they break, we want to spend again, but we don't have the infrastructure. It's a vicious circle that we need to get off the merry-go-round, but it's wrapped up in trade policy and WTO, and it's wrapped up in politics, and it's wrapped up in national security and the behavior of thousands of companies, tens of thousands of companies across the economy. Mary?
Dave,
Mary says you covered it.
Dave, I think we've got time for one final question. Several audience members are asking the panelists to identify what they see as some of the most significant gaps, shortcomings, or outdated nature of our own critical infrastructure here domestically that would hamper our supply chains or our energy systems. And I'll throw that open, maybe Dr. Tinker, to you first.
Sure, I'll try to be real brief. I think we need more capacity across the board. We haven't built refineries in a long time, and that's hurting us. We are not building pipelines in critical places that are needed. Flows of gas have changed. They used to flow from here to the Northeast. Now with the Marcellus, they need to flow the other way and into New York, et cetera. Infrastructure, accessing power lines. We're going to need a lot more of them if we start going to distributed renewable sources. Nobody wants them. We put up 5 major 345 kV power lines in Texas to take all that wind to the demand centers and cities. That was not easy. That was literally on the ground, ranch by ranch, to get some of that done, and some declined. just infrastructure across the board takes time, it's expensive. But again, I'll conclude with optionality. Let's not pick a few winners. Let's keep open flows of all of the different kinds of energy so that we maintain our own options here in our homeland.
Yeah, I think I would just say the same thing across maybe moving away from energy and more into logistics and transportation infrastructure. And that's all aging, bridges, roads, rail. We made, there's $1 trillion in the infrastructure bill that's going to go towards modernizing and updating a lot of that. But we still have these very, what we've seen is lack of investment in our ports and rail. The systems are old, the human systems, the physical systems. All of this needs a relook. Fortunately, we're days away from a potential national rail strike. And fortunately, I think the House just passed a bill. They sent it to the Senate to hopefully avert that strike. But every time we start to make some progress, there's more setback. And if we're gonna compete, reshore, onshore, ally shore, however you want to think about it, we need to be able to move goods efficiently. We need to be able to move them cost effectively, because we're not going to be able to sustain any of this development, any of this industry, without doing it in a cost effective way that can compete on a global stage. So hopefully we'll see progress out of the infrastructure improvements out of these last couple of bills. But yeah, I think that's, combining the human systems with the infrastructure systems is where our future lies.
Yeah.
Over to Mary.
I would just add, all of that is great. And then, where supply chain to add value is form, time, and place utility. So the other things that we may have not mentioned besides those key infrastructure things that have already been said would be water supply. And there's so much risk there in every way you slice and dice that, that holistically, that is a bigger problem that requires a much different approach than we've taken. And then really just basic information flows, keeping a safe and secure information flow is critical to supply chains. And we think about that in many ways, but we've also seen recently examples where, boy, that can change on a dime, things that companies thought were a way they shared information. And then all of a sudden it can, change drastically for them much quicker than they had thought before. So I think those are more recent risks. And as things get more and more connected technology, and you have machines, connected devices, then the risks get higher for all of that.
Dave, mindful of time, I'll turn it back over to you and the panel for closing comments.
Thank you, Dawn. It's interesting. Someone used the word interdisciplinary at the very beginning of the conversation. Scott, you repeatedly referenced portfolios, and you and Mary both emphasized optionality. And Tim, I can't remember if you used this phrase or not, but you talked about sort of the criticality of a healthy ecosystem of choice, and promoting and encouraging that. And I think that applies across all the areas that we've discussed. And it strikes me that that's not how we typically organize our policymaking processes. We typically organize our policymaking processes in a more deconstructionist manner that focuses on specific areas and not the interplay across areas. So sort of one of my takeaways from this is we maybe need to get a little smarter on rethinking our approaches to governance and to policymaking. But let me throw a final question out to each of you. What do you believe that we can do today? What can our audience members do today to follow up on the things we've talked about, to learn more about the issues we've been discussing? What's something actionable you can leave them with? Mary, go ahead.
All right. I will shamelessly plug, CHDS has a really great self-study 5-hour program that you can search for. And I think we're going to throw that link in chat. And then if there's any questions that you've got that, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect. And then UT does have a supply chain resilience, logistics and supply chain resilience in disasters course that I think we can put a PDF on, or I've just posted it on LinkedIn too. And that's done through DHS. And it's a free course through them. So that is a longer course than the self-study, and it's interactive. So I'll throw those
Excellent.
up.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, the notion of this kind of interdisciplinary solutions, the things we've experienced, the successes, it's second nature, I think, to the Homeland Security community. At its core, that's, the CHDS, the Emergency Management Homeland Security, that community knows how to work together across boundaries. So that it should be second nature. And I think there's a lot of value into digging a little deeper into these spaces. And so, people often ask me, like, what's the takeaway, from a government official perspective, to understand at least how industry manages the supply chain, how the market forces impact manufacturing decisions, that sort of stuff. Just think back to early 2020 when people were buying PPE on the black market and hoarding and trying to, state government officials trying to smuggle stuff past CBP. Understanding how this stuff is, how do you prevent doing that again in the future? So now's the opportunity to, all those resources that Mary just talked about, and there's plenty of stuff out there. And then just take some time and understand what are the key resources you need to do your job in response, and then start deconstructing those. Talk to your major suppliers, build those relationships in a non-procurement, non-transactional way, so that when there's a crisis, you understand, what are the limiting factors? What are the pacing items? Where can we intervene? Or how can we help? That stuff now, how do my actions, using or not using a stockpile or a safety stock, going to impact, my suppliers? Maybe I'll put them out of business inadvertently and then have nothing. Those are the things that we don't typically think through and plan through in the Homeland Security space, that we have an opportunity to now. And so there's a lot of tools that weren't available just a few years ago. I strongly recommend availing ourselves of those and building better plans.
The interplay between industrial policy and Homeland Security, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, you get the final word, sir.
Well, I've really enjoyed this. It's been a great visit. As I get older, I turned 63 earlier this year, and I find humility is something that I didn't used to have much of, but it's getting more and more as I just realize so much I don't understand. And I think humility is an important part in this dialogue. I would say to folks that are listening, like Mary said, make a commitment to raise your own IQ a little bit. I'm on the energy side of things. A lot of what we have, we make films on this on Switch website, but just Google PBS Energy Switch and go listen to some of those. Ernie Moniz and Dan Yergin talking about geopolitics. It's 25 minutes, really top level people across the board. And then reach across the aisle, whatever that aisle is for you. It might be political, it might be government to industry to academics, but reach into that middle space and make a commitment to trying to understand what those other components are dealing with as much as you can. I call it the radical middle because it's radically lonely most of the time, but reach into it and try to understand that. And I think we'll develop some dialogues and we'll model some civil dialogues that will improve everything we do. And that to me is the great challenge today. There's so much just almost anger that gets propagated out there across social media and through regular media and in our lives. And we need to get some civility and humility again and start to address these things for real. So I would ask you all to try that. Give it a rip.
Outstanding. Excellent conversation. Thank you all very much. I've really enjoyed it. Dawn, back to you.
Dave, thank you to you as well as our panel for today's conversation. As a reminder, the resources that were mentioned by today's panelists can be accessed in the Q&A box, and we will also post those to the webinar website following today's broadcast. And on behalf of CHDS and our co-host organizations, we thank our audience for joining us. And we invite you to join us back as we continue our America in Transition webinar series, discussing what leaders need to know in 2023, where we'll be each of the next several Wednesdays from now through the end of December. Next week, we're going to be tackling homeland security threats and what those mean both domestically as well as what the foreign threats mean to us here at home. We thank everyone for joining us and look forward to seeing you back soon.